I became convinced that the version of the gospel I'd inherited in the Christian version of Christianity I grew up in was not the same gospel that Jesus had talked about. Jesus' message was about a different way of life, a different way of seeing and organizing and prioritizing life while we're alive on this earth. That was Jesus' main focus. And I think when people started to sense that I was critiquing their very core understanding of what the gospel actually is, they were rightly upset.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Unbelievable, the show that gets Christians and non-Christians talking about the subjects that matter to all of us. I am your host, Andy Kind, and this episode is entitled Life After Doom. And with me today is my guest, Brian McLaren. Hi, Brian.
Hi, great to be with you, Andy.
It's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much. Brian has got a new book called Life After Doom, and it's been described by one reviewer as a book of rare wisdom. So in a world that sometimes feels like it's quite literally falling apart, and this book doesn't shy away from that problem, it also gives us hope by driving us to the key question: what does faith, or whatever worldview we adhere to, help? What does it look like when cynicism seems more plausible than hopefulness? We might turn off social media or decide to avoid the evening news, but we still have that nagging sense that all is not well. Climate change, wars, pandemics, societal fracture and breakdown. We can end up with a sense of frustration bordering on despair. And that's where Brian is going to help us, and has tried to help us with his book. He is an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian, an English graduate of the University of Maryland, and also a former college English teacher and pastor. He is also now a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity. 20 years ago, Brian was awarded a Doctor of Divinity degree from Carey Theological Seminary in Vancouver, Canada, and second honorary doctorate from Virginia Theological Seminary. So with all that said, Brian, congratulations on that CV, and let's get into the show.
Great.
Now, I said to you off screen before we started, when I was a young new Christian in my early 20s and sort of the noughties, I was encouraged to read the works and watch the preachers of certain pastors and preachers and teachers, and strongly encouraged to avoid others, one of whom was a certain man called Brian McLaren. And it's not a view I hold to now, but I think it's interesting that you have had this impact over a good couple of decades now, and it has been unwittingly divisive. I presume unwittingly divisive. You didn't set out to bring a sword, so to speak. But can you talk about, first of all, your spiritual formation and background, and how it is that you came to really tee off the evangelical world?
Yeah, that wasn't my career goal, actually. Andy, I grew up in a very, very conservative, evangelical, you might even call fundamentalist setting. Probably more folks in the UK know this group than in the US where I live. But I grew up Plymouth Brethren. By the time I was 10, 11, 12 years old, I thought my days are numbered in this setting, in large part because I was very interested in science, and we were biblical literalists. So we were told we had to either believe that the earth was created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, or that we weren't really Christians, you know. Also, I grew up in kind of the counterculture hippie era, and I thought the Vietnam War made no sense. I didn't understand colonialism and imperialism and things like that. But my instinct was something was wrong, and I didn't want to be part of that. And I was also very drawn to the arts. I was a lit major in college, and I just was interested in philosophy and art. And it felt to me like there was a lot more depth of meaning than I had inherited in my religious setting. I would say my religious setting went super, super deep in a very, very narrow area of a certain way of reading the Bible, very deep in that area, but not very deep in other areas. So my religious identity was a bit conflicted from the start. I ended up becoming a pastor. And then after, 10 years in the pastorate, really closer to 15 years in the pastorate, I wrote a book, and I tried to be honest about what I was seeing, what I thought was working, what wasn't working. And at first, my first couple of books were very, very warmly received, very well reviewed, and that sort of thing. And that got me a lot of invitations to speak, especially in evangelical settings, where I kind of spoke the language and I understood the rules of the game, so to speak. But my third or fourth book, I began to rattle some cages, and it created a bit of a stir.
And what was it specifically about those third and fourth books that started to rattle those cages? What were you suddenly saying that you hadn't been saying before?
Well, I think I'd been saying it, but it just became clearer. For me, the writing process would be, I'd do my best to write a book, then I'd go out and speak about it, and then people would ask me questions, and that would tell me what the next book needed to be. So really, my journey was related to writing and then listening. But here was I think the real crux of the issue. The word evangelical, for those of us who grew up evangelical, it means having to do with the gospel. Evangel means gospel. Gospel means good news or a joyful announcement, something like that. And I became convinced that the version of the gospel I'd inherited in the Christian version of Christianity I grew up in was not the same gospel that Jesus had talked about. My gospel that I'd inherited was how to go to heaven after you die. And this is very obvious to some people, but it wasn't obvious to me or my tribe. Every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, we do not pray, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May we go to your kingdom in heaven after we die." It's rather, "May your kingdom come, may your will be done here on earth as it is in heaven." So this sense that Jesus' message was about a different way of life, a different way of seeing and organizing and prioritizing life while we're alive on this earth, that was Jesus' main focus. And I think when people started to sense that I was critiquing their very core understanding of what the gospel actually is, they were rightly upset. You couldn't expect anything else.
Yeah, and presumably for some people who maybe had a strong but slightly brittle faith or view of the gospel, it seemed to them as though you were now outside the county lines and had sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And it's interesting because over here in the UK, when we say the word evangelical, we don't mean it in quite as strong a way as it would be meant over in the States. And you can be liberal, you can hold liberal theology without being handed over to Satan by your church. I'm not trying to be flippant, but there is a distinction, and it's less
very much so. Yes,
but even here, again, the word of your demise, spiritual demise, reached us, and it's just a fascinating concept, because reading your books now, what you see is not the sort of abandoning of the gospel, not the syncretism that you were accused of, but you see somebody trying to grapple, as you do in this most recent book, with genuine issues and how as Christians we can meet that on a wide front, not just in this narrow, if you say the sinner's prayer, you will go to heaven. And you touched on it, and it's something I wanted to ask you about. It is the concept of activism. Why is it, in your opinion, that evangelical Christians, maybe on both sides of the pond, have this, in some quarters, resistance to activism? Is it because, as you mentioned, the gospel and evangelicalism is about simply proclaiming the word of the Lord and helping social justice, social action, that there's no proclamation involved in that, and so actually it's got to be a secondary thing? What do you think our sort of problem with the word activism is?
Yes. Well, any religion or any philosophy does a couple of very basic things. First, it tries to say, what's the story we're part of? What's gone wrong? And what should we do to fix it? And in many ways, the Christian story that many of us inherited said, what's gone wrong is Adam and Eve ate a piece of fruit they shouldn't have eaten in the garden. And for that reason, God now is planning to destroy everything and send everybody to hell unless they get an exemption that we call salvation or forgiveness or justification and so on. And so really everything gets defined. That's the problem we're trying to solve. You could call it the problem of original sin or total depravity and so on. And I became convinced that that was the problem as defined by my religious heritage. But when I actually read the Bible, and I should say what got me into trouble was I was a preacher and I had to actually read the Bible a whole lot every week because I was preaching and leading Bible studies. The problem in the Bible was original sin was never mentioned. In the entire Hebrew scriptures, roughly 2/3 of the Bible, nobody's talking about going to heaven or hell. They didn't even believe in heaven and hell in the Hebrew scriptures and in ancient times. That belief didn't even enter Jewish thought until the couple of hundred years before Jesus. And when Jesus speaks on the subject, he's interacting with a conflicted idea in his own community. So activism, in that sense, becomes two things. It's a waste of time. We should spend more time. In fact, here's an analogy I often heard. You're rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, meaning the world is hopeless. It's going to end. It's going to be destroyed. We read biblical prophecy to tell us it was going to be very, very soon. And why even try to fix it? It's supposed to get worse. And if it got better, it would be an embarrassment to us because we are predicting that it's going to get worse. So, yeah.
So talk to us then about this new kind of Christianity, to quote the title of one of your books. What does that look like for you? If it's not a sort of brickish fundamentalism, what does this new kind of Christianity, which presumably you would argue is radical Christianity, is the root Christianity, but what does this new kind of Christianity look like for you?
So I should really give credit to a British missiologist named Leslie Newbigin, who in many ways was the key theological figure who got me thinking about this. And here's what Leslie Newbigin said. He said the greatest heresy, the worst idea in the history of monotheism is a misunderstanding of election. Election meaning how God chooses people. And he said, the misunderstanding is that election is for privilege and not for service. It's a profound idea that he captured in a sentence or two. That to be on God's team, so to speak, does not mean you get to go to the elite club and everybody else is excluded from. Rather, to be on God's team is like joining the first responders and emergency medical team from a hospital that goes out to an accident scene or a natural disaster to try to help people in need. So joining God's team is not a matter of privilege. It's a matter of service. And it doesn't primarily involve benefits and blessings, although there are certainly benefits and blessings, but it actually involves service and suffering and sacrifice. That's what it means to follow Jesus in a life of being more concerned about the well-being of your neighbor than you are about your own comforts and luxuries. And that turns out to be a more joyful life than just living for yourself. So that, I think, is maybe one way to define that.
Yeah, so it's the difference perhaps between putting on your life jacket for when the Titanic sinks and preparing the landing strip for when heaven comes to earth. N.T. Wright, of course, talks about that distinction about heaven coming to earth. So rather than waiting to be zoomed up into some kind of godly alien spaceship, we're actually just preparing the ground and helping the people around us to prepare the ground for when God brings his heaven to earth. Is that a reasonable distinction between those 2 points?
I think that's a good way to say it. Yes, I have to admit, at this stage of my life, as this most recent book makes clear, I think it's unwise for us to assume that we're on a straight path toward God's kingdom coming and God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. I think human beings have the capacity to make foolish decisions, as we've done so often in the past, and we could make our path ahead very, very rough, way rougher than it needs to be.
Yeah, there are no straight paths in nature, are there? So
Yeah.
now let's move on then to your new book, because you've written a number of books, but this new one, Life After Doom, is obviously something that you're passionate about. And so, did that, like your previous books, did that come out of conversations that you'd had about the book before that?
Yes. So, there are so many issues of social justice that people who care about what's going on in this world care about. For example, right now, so many of us are in agony because we simultaneously care about anti-Semitism and we care about the suffering of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And holding those two, we care about both, is a heartbreaking thing to try to hold. We care about racism. We care about the concentration of wealth and power among a tiny global elite, a group of oligarchs who in many ways don't answer to governments. They actually shape governments to continue to support their profit-making endeavors. And we're watching this rise of authoritarianism. I think you have your version of it that you face on your side of the pond, but I'm sure you're able to look across at our side of the pond and just shake your head and say, what is happening to those crazy Americans? So, but it's happening in other places too. So many issues. But sooner or later, whatever issue we care about, we realize that if the earth is not healthy, then every single one of us suffers eventually, and our future generations suffer increasingly, and that every other issue we care about will get worse if we live in a planetary system, in our weather patterns and our ocean patterns and seasons and soils and water are not healthy. Every other issue we care about gets worse. And in the activism work that I've been involved with, especially for the last 20 years or so, I could see that coming, and that brought a sense of urgency to this project.
Yeah, sure. And I suppose the devil's advocate here would say, but if things are getting worse, that's okay because the end of the world is coming, as though we could goad Jesus to come down and put an end to all things. But I do have a question though, within this activism and within this desire to see the continuation of the human species and its flourishing, where then does the gospel and the call to change your mind and turn around, not just about the environment, but about relationship with God and God's love, where does that come in? How do we fit that in through the channel of activism?
Yes. Well, maybe I could make a couple of analogies. If I think of myself as an American, and I could go back in time to the 16 and 1700s when this nation was getting going, and before it had staged its rebellion against your nation. And I could say to people, listen, if you go down this path of slavery, here's what it's going to mean. It's going to mean that you're going to create a group of white people in power in the South who have unimaginable riches. And they're going to create huge amounts of cotton and send that to the North. And that's going to make unimaginable riches. So this entire nation's economy, North and South, is going to be based on the exploitation of human beings, the enslavement of human beings. If you believe in a just God, if you believe in a compassionate God, the God that we find in Exodus turning over Pharaoh's empire to liberate the slaves, you have to see this is not going to end well. And of course, that led to a brutal, ugly civil war. And if that weren't bad enough, my nation did not face its racism. It rather just created new forms of it for the next 100 years after the Civil War. I mean, we had 100 years of apartheid in this country, and we got away with it. And we haven't even talked about the horrible things that were done to the indigenous people during that same period of time. And so if we could go back in time, we would say to people, the way you're living, the decisions you're making are harmful. They're foolish. They won't end well. They're immoral. They're wrong. You need to change your entire way of thinking. That's the meaning of the word repent. In the deepest sense, as I see it, especially when I read the Bible and see what the prophets were saying to people. It wasn't you're in trouble and you're going to go to hell after you die. Nowhere in the Hebrew scriptures is that the danger. The danger is you're living in a way that's going to make your future life and the life of your children and grandchildren to the third and fourth generation horrible and miserable. So change your way of thinking. This is not going to end well. That to me is the good news then is if you change your way of thinking, you could have a much, much, much better future.
I, the Lord, love justice. I hate wrongdoing and iniquity. Presumably we would quote at this point. And because God is love and God is truth and these things are loving and truthful. So that's very good. Whatever people believe, whatever their worldview, and we have people of all worldviews watching Unbelievable. There's a phrase you use in your book that probably sums up how a lot of people are feeling, that unpeaceful, uneasy, unwanted feeling of doom, this sort of hanging shadow above us as individuals and as communities. Can you, just as we come into the break, the last couple of minutes before the break, can you lay out what that is and where we think that's come from?
Yes, I had a moment. I was actually participating in a nonviolent social action to oppose fracking in the Everglades, if you know where that is in Florida, trying to get yet more oil when we already know how much trouble we're in, oil and natural gas, and to potentially destroy another environment for profit. And so I was walking down the road, and a woman who I'd met through some previous actions said to me, "I've given up hope. I don't have any hope anymore." And I said, "Tell me about that." And she just said, "The whole system, it just feels like it's on a suicidal trajectory." She said, I don't think we're going to win. I said, "Well, you're here. Why are you here?" She said, "I've lost hope. I've lost faith, but I guess I'm here because I love the earth and I have to try to protect what I love, even though I think we're not going to win." And I noticed pervasively in the activist community, even though in public, very often people would say, "We can do it. We can win." That behind the scenes, people were saying, "It doesn't look so good." It was getting harder and harder to, well, let me put it this way. Here's how I felt. I felt we're not playing to win. We're playing to not lose so badly. And when that change happens, I think we realize we're going to have to go through some deep interchange, a new way of engaging in the work that we care about. And that's why the subtitle of the book speaks of wisdom and courage and love in a world that's in deep trouble.
Yeah. So in UK footballing terms, we talk about shutting up shop. A team when they go a couple of goals down and just doesn't want to be absolutely routed will just put everyone at the back. So maybe it's a bit like that. But it's interesting, and what we'll come on to in the second section is how we bring the hope of Jesus and the Christian hope of the gospel into that hopelessness. We'll talk more about that in the second half. But we've reached a break, and we're going to take a short break. You're watching or listening to Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind, and my guest, Brian McLaren. Brian's new book, Life After Doom, is fascinating and captivating, and we're talking about that and other things, of course, his divisiveness amongst the evangelical community over the course of this show. So don't forget that you can follow us on all the social media. You can subscribe on YouTube. You can email us, unbelievable@premier.org.uk, at UnbelievableFE on X, formerly known as Twitter, and we're on Instagram and Facebook as well. So for our second part of this interview with Brian McLaren, stay tuned here with Unbelievable and me, your host, Andy Kind.
We are a mix of fabulous and flawed, and that's absolutely everyone. That's not just those who are LGBT identifying. We are all fabulous and flawed.
And it is interesting that the Bible does talk about unanswered prayer. So in the Old Testament, we have Psalms included, which ask, where the hell are you, God? You know, why haven't you shown up and intervened? I'm not sure I believe in you at all anymore.
Sometimes it can feel a little overwhelming, because there's like 10 different answers, and my natural response could be to shut down and be like, oh gosh, I'm going to close myself off to this because it doesn't feel comfortable, and I don't know even where to start or what to choose.
Welcome back to Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind. This is the show that gets Christians and non-Christians talking about the subjects that matter to all of us. My guest today is Brian McLaren. I'm delighted to have him with me, and we are talking not just about doom and gloom, far from it. We are going to offer solutions, or at least ways of thinking rationally about where we could go from here. And in this second part, we're focusing on spiritual leaders who Brian contends needs to help us find a new way of being human in deep connection to one another. Brian, before the break, we talked about the hopelessness that you find even in radical activists, and I mooted the idea of the hope of the gospel being something that we can thread into that. Can you talk a little bit about that? One of your chapters of the book is called "Hope is Complicated." So, how complicated is it, and why, and what?
Yes. Andy, I was just doing an interview a few days ago about this book, and the interviewer had received a copy of the book, but she hadn't opened it yet. And she emailed me and she said, "You're going to end on a note of hope, aren't you?" And I got the feeling from her email that she was worried that if I didn't end on a note of hope, that somehow she shouldn't read the book and she shouldn't like it. And so I just emailed back and I said, well, one of the chapters is called "Hope is Complicated. You might want to read that chapter first." And it ended up, apart from the interview, she's been emailing back and forth with me, because what she realized is her understanding of being a Christian was basically a commitment to being optimistic, to think that things are going to work out. And if we look back in history and we think that just because you're a Christian, things always work out, that's just not true. Here in my country, I think of for 400 years that my country enslaved people. Many of those people that were enslaved were Christians, and they prayed for liberation, and it didn't come for a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4. Their faith, hope, and love had to sustain them while things were not working out. And there is something about hope that can become a bit addictive. It's a way of, here's a way I would say it. We see there's bad news, and we see, for example, the news about climate. There are a few points of light, you could say. For example, our technological progress has been surprisingly fast. We've increased our solar panel production globally. We've increased our battery production globally. There are some really wonderful scientific breakthroughs. Technology is just amazing. And so people see a positive breakthrough, and then they think, oh, good, everything's going to be fine. But guess what? Our politicians and our politics are still not facing reality. The fossil fuel industries still control so much public opinion, and so much of the corporate world and the banking world and the political world are really subsidiaries of the fossil fuel industry. So you face the bad news, and you can't make it go away with a little bit of good news. We have to say, what is reality here? And that's when we are willing to have our easy answers and our what I call cheap hope. When we're willing to have our cheap hope challenged, I think at first it's very sobering and it causes us pain. But I think there comes a different kind of joy that says, ah, I'm starting to see reality, not as I want it to be, but as it really is. And it's very hard for me to explain this, but at this stage in my life, I feel like I'm seeing reality more clearly than I ever have. And the reality is not encouraging, although there's so much encouraging dimensions to it. But the ability to see what's going on creates its own kind of sustaining joy. So that's one dimension of it.
Yeah. So not only is hope complicated, but it's also not optimism, because optimism becomes about confirmation bias and sort of guided apophenia between a small track of pieces of good news, in the same way that when we see a few people baptized on Easter Sunday, we declare that revival has broken out in the land and things like that.
Yes.
So is it the case then that hope is to optimism what joy is to happiness? And do we have a problem as an English major, an English graduate? Do we have a problem with linguistics and semantics and understanding the root words and the meanings of these words?
I think so. I think obviously I am all for hope. Hope is so essential. I have a friend who is a researcher in psychology. He studies hope and the effects of hope, and we've had some fascinating conversations on the psychological benefits of being a hopeful person. But I tell a story in that chapter of Life After Doom called "Hope is Complicated," of an American theologian named Miguel de la Torre, and Miguel says, hope is what is fed to people on the way to slaughter. I mean, that's a powerful statement. And here's what he means. He said this insight came to him when he visited Auschwitz. And above anyone who's entered Auschwitz, will remember this. There's a huge sign that all of the people who are being taken to this death camp had to pass under. And here's what the sign said in German. It said, "Work shall set you free." And so you go through and you think, if I work hard, I will be set free. It was a lie. If you work hard, the Nazis will just get more out of you and before they kill you. So they gave them hope to exploit them, to make them passive for their exploitation. And Miguel de la Torre is trying to help us see there are a lot of people out there who don't want us to face reality. And now, here's the interesting thing. If you lose that kind of cheap hope optimism, everything's going to work out.
We're talking about wishful thinking, really.
Exactly right. Yes, exactly. If we lose that wishful thinking and then we experience despondency, we get the same result. If I think everything's going to be fine, then I don't need to do anything. I can return to my previously scheduled complacency. If I think there's no hope, whatever I do, it's all miserable, there's no use to try, then I also experience a kind of apathy. Why even try? So it seems to me, between that kind of complacent, apathetic, wishful thinking on the one side and the despondency and resignation on the other side, in between those two extremes, there is a zone that calls us to action. And that action, now we have to decide what kind of action we're going to take, because there's frantic action, there's hateful action, there's resentful action. What kind of action are we going to take in between? And that to me is why I end up just appreciating more than ever that simple little phrase from the Apostle Paul, who said, 3 qualities remain: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. And it seems to me that's what we need in times like these.
Well, that was exactly the verse I was going to quote at you, Brian. So
yes.
You've obviously got a gift of prophecy and discernment there. So how do we put, because we want to clarify and qualify, we're not saying that there is no such thing as hope. We're not saying that hope isn't real.
Yes.
And we are looking between the two sort of borders of apathy to plow this third way, this third furrow of hope.
Yes.
But you're arguing, I think, for the idea of putting love on the front foot and
Yes.
keeping hope or not trying to burden hope with too much of a heavy rucksack. Is that?
I think that's a good way to say it. And I think to face the complexity of hope, that hope can easily slip into wishful thinking. And then when wishful thinking proves harmful, we slip into despondency, both of which leave us. Here's a way Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian activist, said, we cease to be protagonists in our own story. In other words, we're just along for the ride, whether it's a ride toward bliss or a ride toward destruction. We aren't protagonists. I think what faith and hope and love are really supposed to do is empower us to be protagonists in the story of what's going on in this planet. And here's why I think love becomes especially important in times like these. If my house were on fire and my grandchildren were visiting and they were in the house, I wouldn't say, I need to decide what the odds are of me going in to try to save them without me being seriously injured. I don't sit down and try to calculate. I love my grandchildren. I'm going to run in and do whatever I can to save them. Love will motivate me to risk my own life for what I love. And this, I think, is why one of the reasons Paul said faith and hope are really great, but love is the greatest, because love motivates us to go beyond. Love motivates us to put somebody else's life, somebody else's needs and benefits above my own. That's a pretty amazing thing.
That really is, and sounds like good gospel stuff to me, Brian, as well. Now, there's a line in your book where you talk about people and tackling this sense of despondency and despair. You say what you'd want to say to people is the small part I am doing now matters. So the small part I'm doing now matters. For individuals and for churches, what are those small parts that we can play then? Talking about individuals first, and then maybe branching out into what churches can do. What are the small things, the baby steps that we can make now?
Yes. Well, first, let me say, and this might shock some people, but the idea that we're going to solve this problem by you and I, Andy, reducing our carbon footprint. I believe it's important for us to reduce our carbon footprint, but that idea itself was created by people in the fossil fuel industry to try to make us feel guilty about and responsible to solve this, so we don't put the pressure on the fossil fuel industry itself. Here's the two most important things we can do. First, we can vote. We can vote for people who care about the earth, who are more realistic and less sunken in wishful thinking. Very often we don't have a choice between people dealing with reality and people not. We have a choice with people dealing with a little bit of reality or no reality at all. So we have to do the best we can in politics, but voting actually matters, because the changes we need ultimately are systemic changes. We have to reorganize our entire ways of living to live more sustainably with the earth. And by the way, it's not just climate change. It's it's a whole array of issues that ecologists call the problem of overshoot. We're sucking out more than the earth can replenish, and we're pumping out more toxins and poisons and waste products than the earth can detoxify. And that is a recipe for not only suicide for our species, but for ecocide of this earth. So first is we can vote. Second is we can talk. And we should talk to everybody we can. I advocate, somebody says, "Hey, how are you doing today?" You say, "Well, I'm doing great, but it's another day where I think we need a new relationship with the earth. We have to live more respectfully with the earth and with each other. We just find ways to let our words and our writings and our behavior point people toward a different way of life.
Yeah. And what about churches? What can churches do?
The first thing I think churches can do is face our culpability in the mess that we're in. We had this incredible treasure of the Bible. I think of the Bible as a precious and dangerous gift. It's precious because it has wisdom we need. It's dangerous because it's so easy to abuse. So here's what we did. In the first couple chapters of the Bible, we're given a verse that says to human beings to exercise dominion over the earth. That's in chapter 1 of Genesis. And in chapter 2, it says to till and take care of the earth. So what we did is we forgot about the take care of the earth part, and we just quoted the heck out of dominate the earth, have dominion. In fact, when we turned to have dominion to dominate and exploit, that in itself was a foolish act on our part. And so our churches, because of that theology, what my friend Diana Butler Bass calls elevator theology, it's only about getting our souls up to heaven. It's not about God's will coming down and being expressed here on this earth. Because of that theology, we gave moral cover and permission to exploit the earth and bring us to this horrible situation. And living in the country where I live, I can tell you this is not only in the past. When people say we need to take care of the earth, people say our fellow Christians come back and say, "Oh no, Jesus is coming back soon. We might as well exploit the earth all we can, since we're God's children, and God would want us to be happy and prosperous and rich." So we have to face the culpability for the mess we're in, and then we have to rectify it, and we rectify it by teaching a more thoroughly biblical and wise view of ourselves and the earth. And if I could just say one other thing that will mean in our preaching, it won't just mean every once in a while that we preach a sermon about the environment. What it will mean is that we will face the fact that our gospel work is inviting human beings into a whole new value system, imagining a way of life that is almost unimaginable now, a way of life where we actually care. Well, here's how Pope Francis said it. We hear the cries of the earth and the cries of the poor, and we're unsatisfied to let things go on as they're currently going.
That's great. And then for churches who would call themselves evangelical, and obviously you've got no problem with a church being evangelical, but for churches who would call themselves that and are still interested, maybe looking and listening to what you're saying and thinking, yes, well, okay, well, I don't simply believe that the earth was made in 7 days or is 6,000 years old, and I don't believe that it's going to end straight away and needs to be burned up as soon as possible. But I'm not hearing from Brian anything about Jesus. I'm not hearing from Brian anything about the gospel. What would you say to those people who think something like, "Oh, well, you see, did you hear what Brian said when he said we need to have a better relationship with the earth? That's quite pagan, personifying the earth. It's Gaia, it's Mother Nature, no mention of Jesus." I'm sure you must have had critics like this. Sure. How do you graciously sort of affirm the genuine desire to talk about Jesus whilst also broadening it out into that wider conversation?
Yes. Well, I hope folks who read the book will read 2 chapters, especially in the book. One is called "Don't Read the Bible," and then in parentheses it says "The Same Old Way." And the chapter right before it, those 2 chapters, I offer a reading of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, a very high overview of reading the Bible as a text for which ecology, care for the earth, is not a peripheral matter. It is a core matter of the biblical text. And one of my favorite parts of writing the book was the passage where I talk about Jesus. And it's sudden. I just have to say, the older I get, and the more deeply I engage with Jesus and with the Gospels and with Paul's understanding of Jesus, and I just see he is so right, and he is what we need now. Let me just give an example, a passage that many people know and maybe even sing parts of it. Seek first the kingdom of God and God's righteousness or justice. Everything you need will come to you. I think what Jesus is saying in those words strike to the very heart of our issue, because what he's critiquing comes right before that. He said, don't be anxious about your food, what you'll eat. Don't be anxious about clothing, what you'll wear. In other words, don't be anxious about the standards set by this economy. This economy makes you have to dress up to show your social class and social status, how cool and rich and so on that you are. And this culture wants you to eat and waste as much food as possible to be a good consumer, right? So Jesus says that does nothing but create anxiety. That's when he says the Gentiles, what he means is the Romans. And when he says the Romans, what he means is people who live by this earth's destructive economy and social structure. He says, seek first an alternative kingdom. And when he wants to illustrate that, he says, look at the birds of the air, look at the flowers of the field. This to me is Jesus' invitation for us to come back to be part of the community of creation, not above creation to exploit and dominate over it, but to be part of it, to join what Thomas Merton called the general dance, this beautiful dance of nature. So I think for some Christians, that will sound horrible and pagan to them because they've been taught a way of seeing Jesus that is all about escaping this earth and going to heaven. I understand why they think this is terrible. They think I'm wrong to have this emphasis. I understand that, and it's fine with me if they think I'm wrong. If I could beg them to open themselves to the possibility that the tradition they've inherited might not be the best tradition. That doesn't require them to reject Jesus. It only requires them to actually repent, to rethink some of their inherited assumptions, which, by the way, I don't think just come from Christian theology. I think they come from capitalism. I think they come from centuries of white supremacy and colonialism and Eurocentrism and so on. Yeah.
So it's Brian McLaren says it's Jesus who is king, not just tradition. How about that? How about that for a quote?
I like that.
Put that on a T-shirt, Brian, because there will be people, and I know people who have swapped Christianity for activism. I know people who've used environmentalism and social justice as a form of spiritual methadone. Because what happens when you start doubting your faith, you still have that sense of justice and wanting to be a good person, and so you sort of use that as a sprat to catch a mackerel, almost a sort of slippery slope. But it's reassuring to hear that you're saying that it's not Christianity or activism, it's not the gospel or social justice, that activism and social justice are part of this wider concept, wider reading of what it means to repent and believe the gospel and live in a way that prepares the earth for the ultimate coming of Jesus, given that only the Father knows when that's going to happen. Is that?
Yes. Andy, as you say that, I think you just sort of gave me an insight into my own life. Good. I grew up in a version of Christianity that was very happy to say the world is a mess and other forms of Christianity are a mess. But my form of Christianity is all right and true and good. And I guess what I'm advocating is to say the world's a mess. Christianity's a mess. We're all a mess. Jesus has the way out of the mess. Let's actually try to pay attention to what he did and how he lived and what he said, and let's follow in that path.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to the end of the show, and my guest today on Unbelievable has been Brian McLaren. His new book, Life After Doom, is the thing we've been talking about. And it hasn't been all doom and gloom, I have to say. Brian isn't the doom bringer that so many of us worried he was going to be when he showed up on our screen with a ukulele in the background. We just didn't know. But it's been a delight to talk to you, Brian. Thank you for your time and your wisdom. And thank you to you, listener, viewer, for watching and listening. You can contact us if you want to. Unbelievable@premier.org.uk, that's the email. Or get in touch via social media at UnbelievableFE for X, formerly Twitter, at Premier Unbelievable for Instagram, and Facebook.com/Premier Unbelievable. We release content every week, so do check out our YouTube channel, subscribe to the podcast, and stay tuned for more exciting content coming up in future weeks from Unbelievable. From me, my host, your host, Andy Kine, and all the team here, goodbye.